Good afternoon. Please take your seats. It's packed out, which is wonderful. Welcome to the Martin School, and welcome to the second lecture in our Great Transitions series. You're in for a treat today. We have Doyne Farmer, and I always try to pronounce your name wrong, Doyne. So Doyne Farmer and Cameron Hepburn on tipping points in the post-carbon society. And I won't try and explain what they're going to explain because it's much better coming from them. Doyne Farmer, I first came across in a wonderful book called The Newtonian Casino about beating the roulette wheels at Las Vegas using programmable computers in the heel of Doyne's shoe, I think. And he's been predicting things ever since, and time series and markets and all kinds of things. And he's become the expert on making those kind of predictions. And I think it was that marrying of an initial career in physics to a career in economics. We physicists have got to be good for something. This is a double act. I think it's tag team wrestling or something, because also Cameron Hepburn. Cameron is pretty much ubiquitous in this world of helping understand what the future holds for us. He's had a fantastic career in the economics of many of the things that are challenging our world at the moment: climate change, food, CO2 in the ground, CO2 in the air. We had a wonderful meeting at the Royal Society on carbon capture and utilisation, in which he produced a very provocative paper and a wonderful contribution. So we're in for a great treat. So Doyne and Cameron.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have such a crammed room. And it makes me feel like I hope we don't disappoint you tonight, because what we're about to report is the beginnings of a research project. We haven't got all the answers yet. We're just starting. So there are some intriguing things that we have to say this evening. But equally, we both came here hoping that we might get some intriguing things back from you. So put your thinking caps on. We want to hear from you at the end, what we've missed, what we might be thinking about, because this is complicated stuff and certainly very interesting. But let's get into it. So we have 5 parts to our talk. We're going to introduce to you the new Oxford Martin program on the post-carbon transition and who the people are and what we're trying to do. Then, in a sense, motivate why this program exists, because I suspect if you're sitting here in the audience, you know that we are very far from being on track to a post-carbon society. We're starting to move. Things are starting to happen. There are glimmers, in fact, quite exciting glimmers of hope, but none of it's happening fast enough. So in a sense, the motivation for this project is how can we identify the pieces that might accelerate this transition? And that takes us to the third part. So where might these socioeconomic tipping points be found? And in particular, where are the regions of this complicated set of socio-political economic systems that are sensitive to intervention? Where can we poke them just a little bit and hopefully get an outsized response to a little poke? Then we'll have a quick look at how this transition, if we do accelerate it, could affect particular nations, asset holders, forms of capital, and also jobs and workers. Of course, we will do this in great depth over the coming 3 years, and you're going to have to give us a little bit of leeway, some rope, perhaps not enough to hang ourselves with, but a certain amount of rope because we are literally just a few weeks in. And then describe the plans ahead. Now, Steve generously said I was ubiquitous in these areas. I think that sitting there thinking, maybe that's why I'm so tired. I need to stop the ubiquity side. Let's move on. So this is the structure. If you're thinking about getting to a post-carbon transition, and doing it fast, then as much and all as I like to think economists are also good for something, we can't do it with just economists. We can't just do it with physical scientists and physicists. We can't do it merely with psychologists. We can't do it with anthropologists. We can't do it with medical sciences. We can't do it with historians. We need everyone together. And so this is a fundamentally, deeply rooted interdisciplinary project. We have professors, senior professors from across the 4 divisions of the university collaborating in this project, from social psychology through to history, to philosophy, to economics, to physics, to you name it. If we need it, it's there. And we'll be thinking about the impact, as I said, on nations, on capital, and on labor, and we'll be doing it across a range of different ways. To introduce the people to you, obviously you have the 2 of us who I think someone described as a highly unlikely pair. Whatever, that works for me. It's a very enjoyable pairing, certainly on my side. But we also have some great expertise across, and many of these names will be familiar to you, whether it's in political science and governance from Tom Hale, Miles Houston, a social psychologist, Jane Humphreys, an excellent historian of the Industrial Revolution, Miles Allen, known to many of you, I think, if you've come to this talk, as having created the concept of the carbon budget, Anders Sandberg, a big-thinking, forward-looking, philosophical type. Some of you probably here, so I hope I'm not embarrassing you. And Alex Titelbaum, an economist. But as ever, the engine of the work isn't going to be us. It's, we succeed or fail depending on the quality and the caliber of the intellects on this page, and I'm pleased to say that they're very high. So we have a strong team. So that's who we are. That's where we're, the collection of characters on this journey. Now let me tell you why we've started on the journey. We've started on it because we've got COP21 in Paris. It was a big achievement in some ways. It set very clear and very ambitious targets. We need a net zero emissions world. And inside the agreement is the requirement for a balance between sources and sinks of emissions. Now, this is no small challenge to completely decarbonize the entirety of the global economy, not just the UK, not just Europe, not just America, it's China, it's India, it's everywhere. Total decarbonization. And that has to happen fast. It has to happen sometime in the second half of this century. If we're serious about 1.5 degrees, doubtless it'll be earlier in the second half of the century, if not a little bit before 2050. So these are big goals, and we know we're not on track yet, so we've got a process for reviewing ambition to meeting those goals. And you can tell by starting to think, starting by saying where are we now, and we are here, as the little dot shows, in terms of our cumulative CO2 emissions and the temperature increase so far. So we're roughly at a degree of warming. And we're emitting almost 40 billion tons of CO2 a year. It may be stabilizing. That's an awful lot of CO2 going into the atmosphere every year. And if you combine that fact with some research we did recently on baked-in emissions, so looking at the existing capital stock of power plants, of infrastructure, and saying, let's assume for a moment that that infrastructure, that kit, is run for its normal economic life. Where does that leave us as far as 1.5 or 2 degrees goes? And the answer is it leaves us already at 2 degrees. We've already built the 2-degree capital stock, actually with 50-50 probability. And you don't really want 50% probability only of 2 degrees. You want a much higher probability of staying below 2 degrees. So when we're not on track, we're already behind, as it were, in that we've built out enough a kit to take us over 2 degrees effectively with 50% probability. So it's a big motivator. We're coming from behind. We need things to change. We need them to change radically. That's our starting point. And it's worth then stepping back and reflecting, well, why are we here? And it's all too easy to say, well, we're here because we haven't had enough political commitment. Okay, but why did we not have enough political commitment? What are the underlying causes? And one of our hypotheses is that a part of this problem is because the way the climate system and the economic system has been modeled. Now that may sound unlikely to you. There's all sorts of things going on here. But bear with me for a second. You've got a series of experts around the world, economists, physicists, etc., modeling the impact of climate change and concluding that this transition is going to be very expensive. And most economists would say, yes, of course, it is. It's what we know, isn't it? Don't we know that? And Doyne and I and the team are questioning whether we really know that. And the reason we think we have grounds to question that is if you dig into the economic models of climate change, you find that not all is always well. They very often start with assumptions that many of you would find utterly implausible. Now, that doesn't mean they're bad models necessarily. Bad assumptions don't always make bad models. But it does ring some alarm bells. The thing that really rings alarm bells is that much of the modelling, the economic modelling in this area, and much of the economic projections in this area has failed to understand the pace of change within the renewables sector so far, just how quickly costs have come down and are coming down, and just how quickly businesses, investors, and other parts of, well, civil society are switching, both in their worldview and in their actions, towards a low-carbon transition. And we'll say say later on in more detail where we think things may be going wrong with the existing modelling. But let me just say here that those models frame a narrative that is a very powerful narrative, that we should do something about climate change, but it's going to cost us, so maybe let's not do it now. If you had a different narrative, that there is a world out there that is cleaner, that is smarter, that is safer, and that is cheaper, you might find that expectations shift faster. With expectations shifting faster, capital gets deployed in different ways, perception of risk falls, cost of capital falls, etc., etc. And we're going to talk you through some of these self-reinforcing dynamics of the positive type that we're trying to identify and model differently. But suffice to say that Lord Stern, who was here at an Oxford Martin School event last week, has said there's an urgent need for a new generation of models that give a more accurate picture of the cost of climate change. And not just Nick either. There's leading mainstream economists across the board, including in the States, have said, okay, enough is enough. We need to think about modeling this differently because these models are leading to narratives that are very, very unhelpful. So one of our early hypotheses, and I expect you to read every word on this chart, is that the estimated costs of reducing emissions are too high. And Doyne's got a cracker for you later coming. But let me just say that you can see the little circle there, 5% of consumption losses. Now, because I too am starting to lose my sight, I blew this up for you. You still probably can't see that, or at least if you're me, you probably can't. But so these are the consumption losses in 2100 of being on a 2-degree pathway. So it's not including the benefits of climate change or the co-benefits, but 5% of consumption lost relative to baseline by tackling this problem. That's an estimate from the IPCC. It might be right. But is it not conceivable? It's certainly not, in my mind, inconceivable that the costs of clean energy, that the costs of clean economic production by 2100 could be cheaper than the cost of doing things in a dirty way. And so those net costs, those net consumption losses could be negative, couldn't they? 2100, it's a long way away. There's a lot of technological progress to happen between now and then. And for me, this is one of the things that just starts you thinking, is all really going well in these models, or are they just assuming that the future is going to be the same as the past? Now, I don't mean to insult my economist colleagues at the IPCC who do very good and very diligent work, but this is a complicated problem where we need all the disciplines, and we haven't had all the disciplines thinking about these sorts of models thus far. And that's a fantastic point for me to say, enough from economists. Let's hear from a physicist.
I guess we're trying to incorporate many different elements into the modeling program that we're using, and one of them is a different approach to thinking about technological change. And the reason I've showed you this picture here with a little landscape is to get across the idea that the technological change, the landscape can be quite complicated. And things tend to get stuck because of lock-in. We build a fossil fuel infrastructure that involves having the grid built in a certain way. It involves plants that are constructed in a certain way. And we get stuck in a local maximum. And every time there is an incremental decision, marginal costs are always cheaper to just stay up near that local maximum, doing things that are more or less the way they are now. But we have an opportunity now to move off of that local maximum onto another one and try and find something that's better. And in particular, one of the things that have been missing are reasonable estimates about acknowledgments of the fact that different technologies really behave differently. So in this slide, you can see that there's a difference between, on one side, I'm showing you the cost of 3 different energy generation technologies as a function of time. One of them is coal, and in particular, I'm just showing you the cost of the fuel, which is around 40% to 50% of the cost of generating coal-fired electricity. The plant being the other big element. Plants have gotten cheaper for a while. They pretty much flattened out in 1985 and haven't gotten any cheaper since then. So ultimately, it's about the cost of the coal. So here we see the coal fuel price over about 150 years. And what you see is it has fluctuated a little bit, but once you adjust for inflation, there's no obvious trend. In fact, you fit a model to this, you get a random walk without drift. These red triangles here show the cost of nuclear power plants in the United States, showing the cost of each plant measured at the time when the plant was put online. And what you can see is across the 25 or 30 years that plants were coming online in the US, there's a trend, it's that it got more expensive. Now, of course, during that period, we had 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and accidents that caused the nature of nuclear power to change, a lot of concern about safety, which is probably accounting for most of that rise. Now, in contrast, let's look at solar energy. Now, I'm planning a little bit different, plotting things a little bit differently. This is the cost of building a module. And so we're just looking at the cost of that module, a module that can generate a watt if you shine full sun on it. And what you see is something completely different. The costs are plummeting at 10% per year. The cost of a solar cell now is about a 3,000th of what it was when the first solar cell was installed in the Vanguard satellite in 1956. In contrast, the cost of nuclear reactors, now there's Hinkley Point's projected cost out there, is about the same as the first commercial nuclear reactor in Britain in 1956. So the two technologies have behaved very differently, indicating you really need to think carefully about, you need to acknowledge those differences. Now, Francois Lafond and I did a study where we looked at 50 different technologies through time and their costs. And one of the things we observed is the costs are very persistent. Once you get on a trend, they fluctuate around that trend. You know, there's no a priori reason to say the trend couldn't be broken, but most of the time those trends continue, and the trends are exponentials. Most technologies follow Moore's law. They follow Moore's law at a rate that may not be the 40% per year drop that Moore hypothesized, but there's nonetheless some rate at which they drop. And actually, I have to amend what I said. Many technologies don't improve at all. We saw coal, oil, those are examples of technologies that over spans of 100 years cost about now what they did 100 years ago. But many other technologies improve, they improve at different rates. Computers being an example of a rapidly improving technology, genomics improving even more rapidly than that, photovoltaics improving at around 10% per year, still rapid, not as rapid. Now, what we did is we developed a method for taking data, utilizing our experience on all the other technologies, making forecasts, and assigning probabilities to that the forecasts are valid. So that here you see a forecast for solar photovoltaics. You see the likely zone in here, the somewhat less likely zone, and a 2 standard deviation. That is, there's a 95% of the events should lie within here. this says that, well, we can't say with certainty that solar photovoltaics are going to continue to improve. It seems to be significantly the most likely outcome. There's about a 3 or 4% chance that by 2030, they will not have improved. Now, you can also ask about, well, how fast can they be scaled up? Well, in fact, the answer seems to be pretty fast. When you look at the historical trend, the average rate at which solar photovoltaics have been scaling up is around 45% per year. And while there's wiggles in this curve, you can see there's a kind of a plateau down here, it's been reasonably consistent. And if you extrapolate this trend, one of the nice pieces of news is you reach about 20% of primary energy around 2027. That is 10 years from now, not that far into the future. Now, we stopped at 20% because there's big problems with storage, and you have to think about storage to go much beyond that. But nonetheless, that's encouraging news. And if our other forecast is right, by say 2050, these technologies might be substantially cheaper, so you can afford a lot more room for storage. Now, I have to make a comment that the International Energy Association has been projecting the deployment of solar energy every year for a long time, and they're still saying that solar PV will generate 16% of electricity by 2050. So they're projecting something significantly less about here. And in fact, I can't resist showing you a comparison of what's happened to their predictions. These are their predictions. So sitting in 2005, they predicted we would be here in 2015 and here in 2030. And then we go forward a few years and they make another forecast like this, and they make another forecast like this. And what you can see is every single time they've been forecasting too low. It's as if they can't plot on semi-log scale. And so it's quite remarkable. And so we'll see how it is going forward, but this is at least a cause for some optimism. Now, in fact, I was tempted to show you some preliminary results with graphs and show on here. It would be one of the first outputs of the project. We decided not to. The results are preliminary. I think they're also pretty surprising because what we're finding is because by exerting effort towards moving towards solar and wind, both of which have been really improving in contrast to the alternatives, we have the potential to get off this peak that we've been stuck on and actually have energy be cheaper than it was in the past. So even without worrying about climate change and carbon and so on, we actually get a benefit to society just in terms of net present value. And we've been trying to work out what that is based on our forecast. And let me just say the answers look very encouraging. It looks like, according to us, we actually have a big win by moving to solar. I mean, we have to invest something to get past the hump, but then we gain back a lot and make a big win going forward. Now, back to, Cameron mentioned modeling the economic consequences of climate change. We wrote a survey, we being Cameron and me and Penny Mealy and Alex Teitelbaum, both of who were on the roster we showed before, and Alex and Penny did most of the work, we have to admit. So we surveyed the state of the art of the models that exist now and made a list of reasons why we weren't happy with the way they were handling things. We weren't happy in general with their assumptions about technological progress. We didn't feel like they were dealing with the fact that the world is a highly heterogeneous place. They aren't thinking about things like how the transition to climate change is going to affect inequality, both in terms of the expenses we have to make to cope with it, or at least the costs we have up front. We again think there's probably a long-term gain, but also from the consequences, how those may influence inequality. They aren't dealing very well with the uncertainty. They aren't dealing very well with the irreversibility. They aren't dealing very well with catastrophic risk and the chance of a catastrophic risk. And in part because they're based on assumptions of rationality and optimality that we don't think are fairly plausible. There also are some alternatives, doing things like agent-based modeling. These alternatives are promising, but not nearly well developed enough. And that's an effort we hope to support. Now I want to say a little bit about tipping points, because we're looking at trying to understand what the tipping points are and how sensitive intervention, what are the sensitive intervention points where we could do a little bit to make a large change. And so first of all, a tipping point is a place where things, where change starts to happen and becomes irreversible. So I put in this diagram here. I don't quite agree with the diagram that I would actually not say the tipping point is here. I would say the tipping point is once this gets rolled down the hill a little while, it starts to accumulate momentum. It gets harder and harder to move back to the place it came from. And in fact, this is a sensitive intervention point where a little kick could cause it to go this way or that way. And so if you'd rather go this way, you better do that right. And so I have, this example, I asked, so I don't know if you can see it. I'll let you watch it one more time. The parrot intentionally kicks the turtle into the bucket. Now, okay, I asked Maria, I asked my students for an example of a sensitive intervention point, and I couldn't resist putting this in. Of course, if you could intervene up until this point, but once the parrot pushes the turtle into the bucket, forget it, it's over. Now, a slightly more serious example, well, I don't know, I couldn't decide whether to tell this story. So, excuse me, I think I just hit my mic. When I was 15, my friend Dave Miller and I talked our scoutmaster into letting us try to hike across the Superstition Wilderness in one day. Very ambitious thing to do, actually. So we set out, hiking a mile a minute, and by midday we'd lost the trail, and about 1 o'clock we came to this point where we were looking down at 3 canyons.
So that it doesn't make that noise.
Okay, sure. Oh, sure. Okay, well, there you go. Okay, all right, okay. We reached this point where we're looking out across the place where the valley, there were 3 canyons going down. And so we kind of looked around, we said, well, the middle one looks like the right one. And we started to walk down and it got steeper and steeper and worse, and about 2,000 feet down, we hit a sheer cliff. And we realized we couldn't go any farther, and clearly we had taken the wrong path. So at that point, we had to climb up. This took us another hour or 2, and we were exhausted. And we looked back at this same place we were before, and this was the sensitive intervention point. If we just thought about it a little more, we would have realized it was the 3rd valley, the 3rd canyon we should have taken. We took the 3rd canyon, everything was fine. We got there just at dusk. But just a little bit more thought at that point would have made a huge difference in terms of what the outcome was for our day. Now, the final example I want to give here is a very elegant one of NASA. There was a satellite, the ISEE-3, that was initially in a halo orbit that you see over there, going around in a circle between the Earth and the Sun. And they decided they wanted to get this satellite to chase this comet. So they gave 3 little pokes, 3 little controls. The satellite went into an orbit that looks like this, and went, and then it did like that, and it started tracking the comet. So, of course, we're not going to be able to do that with the economics of climate change, but it is a kind of existence proof that you can do some very elegant and powerful things. In our case, the goal is, as we move from this fossil fuel local maximum, that we can think about the sensitive intervention points to move to the green energy, we hopefully higher local maximum in the course of doing what we're doing in this program. And just to illustrate this can make a difference, Maria and Tony took the demographic projections and asked the question of, well, if you extrapolate GDP growth, because as GDP per capita gets higher, emissions per capita get higher, and we have to worry about the fact that India and China, we want them to develop and become wealthy, but if they develop and become wealthy, they're, in business as usual scenarios, going to start emitting more greenhouse gases because people with more wealth, use more material goods and emit more greenhouse gases. So the question is, what difference can we make by going to a more sustainable energy generation path? So we took the best demographic projections available for India and China. We extrapolate the trends in per capita GDP growth for India and China. And then we look at two scenarios, one in which it's a business as usual, in which we go on emitting as much as we do now per capita GDP, and another one in which we transition to 20 to 50% renewables by 2050, in which case we substantially reduce per capita GDP emissions or per emissions per capita GDP. And we can see, actually, I find this a bit frustrating because you see the scenarios are not as, even that isn't nearly as effective as we would like. Cameron, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Right, so I don't have nice pictures of satellites or even better parrots kicking tortoises into a rubbish bin. But what I wanted to do is to just explore self-reinforcing dynamics of the sort that Doyne started to introduce in four spaces as they may be relevant to climate change. And so let's start by thinking about citizen preferences and ethics and morals. Now, there are a lot of philosophers who say you won't get the scale of fundamental change in human society that's required with getting to net zero emissions without a shift in morality or a shift in philosophy, a shift in ethical views. We need to stop eating meat. We need to stop doing this, that, or the other. There are others who disagree with those views, but irrespective of whether you think it's necessary or not, there's no doubt that there is a possibility that as people shift their views of what's okay, and some of you have doubtless read that Oxford University is still investing in fossil fuels. I'm half expecting a question at the end of this session. Is that morally okay? And there's probably a lot of you and a lot of people around the country who think it's not okay morally. And so if you start to take action, we can debate that, but if you start to take action based on your ethical views, and those actions get communicated to others who think, well, hang on, they think that's not okay. Maybe that isn't okay. Maybe I shouldn't be doing that too, and others behave likewise until you get a revolution. That's one way in which you can, by a few powerful, charismatic individuals leading the charge, can mobilize large numbers of people to shift morality and then shift behavior. Now, a different area of self-reinforcing dynamics is around expectations. So suppose you think we are going to an electric vehicle world. You think the Oxford City Council's absolutely going to nail it. We're going to refuse to have internal combustion engines in the centre of Oxford. And you're wondering what car you should buy. Well, you don't buy an internal combustion engine, do you? And you also think, well, okay, well, I'll go ahead and buy the EV, and then enough people buy the EV, and so enough companies want to put in the charging points, or the council wants to put in the charging points, which means more people buy the EV. Because more people are buying EVs, the cost of the EVs come down, and because there's a large market, there's a consumer finance space for EVs, there's other ancillary services for EVs, and off you go. You're through the valley, you're climbing back up to the clean maximum there on Doyne's chart. And this happens across the board, whether it's EVs or whether it's solar or whether it's zero carbon goods and services, etc. There's a way in which expectations of consumers can shift purchasing patterns, which can shift the benefits to other consumers, which can further shift expectations, and so on. Now, if we look at the private sector economic side, on the production side, if you're a manufacturer of wind turbines, the kick might be the government giving you a feed-in tariff or renewables obligation certificate. You have various economists noting the reality that this is an extremely expensive way of delivering energy, which it was 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. And you even have government civil servants saying, those guys in the wind industry, we gave them £140 a megawatt hour, and now when we do a reverse auction, it turns out they can do it at 58. And they weren't lying at 140. It just happens that with technological progress, a bit of competitive pressure, the costs come down. But because the costs come down, people buy more. And when people buy more, the costs come down. And when the costs come down, people buy more. And when people buy more, the costs come down and off you go in another reinforcing dynamic. There's another example there, and I alluded to it at the start. You can have the financial sector saying, solar, come on, solar, I'm not going to finance solar. It's expensive, what is it? It's not a proper power station. It's not a combined cycle gas turbine. So, everyone steers clear of it. Then a few bold bankers go where no banker has ever gone before and finance some solar. And turns out it's incredibly low risk. You just take a bunch of these things, you connect it up, your 5-year-old kid can do it. And so the cost of capital comes down. Instead of charging 15% on your debt for your solar farm, it goes down to 10, down to 5. And in Germany, it's somewhere between 2 and 3%. And given that most of the cost of energy from solar is the capital, because the sun's free, getting the cost of capital down makes the solar incredibly cheap, which means every banker wants to finance it, which means the cost of capital comes down further. And you have the sort of dynamic result that we had in Saudi Arabia just recently of a PPA struck at 1.786 cents per kilowatt hour, which is less than half the records that we were hitting not too many years ago on solar. So there are positive and very exciting reinforcing dynamics there. And government can even get on this action too. We saw with Paris a set of governments coming together to make pledges. Okay, not strong enough, not ambitious enough, but ambitious all the same. Now imagine if one government were to say, we're going to put on a carbon price, and we don't like the idea of other countries not paying our carbon price. We want a level playing field. So if you want to sell products into our country, you have to pay the carbon price. It's a border adjustment, a border carbon adjustment. Now, if you're an exporting country into a country buying your goods, do you think, do I want them collecting the carbon price, or should I levy it at home? Well, you probably want to levy it at home. So you levy your carbon price at home, and having done that, you think, well, actually, maybe I want a border adjustment as well, because I've got a carbon price at home, and those guys don't have a carbon price. So you put the border adjustment in with your carbon price, and somebody else puts in a carbon, and off you go again until you have a club of countries putting in a carbon price. So the point is that there are lots of these self-reinforcing dynamics, and they cut across these domains too. It's not as if they're separate. Because consumers buy more, governments feel emboldened to put more ambitious targets. Then they put policies behind it that reduce the costs. And because the costs are coming down, consumers are buying more. And because it's suddenly all much easier to make this transition, dare I suggest that people's ethics might find it a little bit easier to shift their ethics too. So for instance, we're discussing artificial meat here. Now, this is one of these cases where citizen preference and ethics are going to matter enormously. You can look at artificial meat and think, meat grown in a lab, Franken meat, I don't want that. Or you can think, let's think about the other sort, meat in an abattoir, disease vectors everywhere, blood, this is not and a supply chain that leaves you with deforesting vast tracts of land. Why not have purely clean ultra meat? More people buy ultra meat, if that's what it ends up being called, I don't know, you heard it here first. The costs come down, there are clever scientists who do clever material science and biology and so on, and before you know it, we're not deforesting half of the land that we currently are to feed people meat. Okay, so there's some examples. There are more examples here on the self-reinforcing dynamics side. You probably had enough of me going through these. In fact, I think I've covered some of them. Although actually the one from that list I might pick up on is that there's evidence now that not only if you adopt rooftop solar, is your neighbor more likely to adopt it, because whether your name is Jones or not, they probably want to keep up with you. But that affects your behavior at home and your energy consumption. And critically, it also affects your voting behavior. Who knew? Buying a solar panel ends up shifting voting patterns, according to some studies. So as you can already see, in terms of the linkages across these spaces, private consumer action can start to affect public action and so on. Okay, so there's lots of these dynamics. There are psychological ones, there are business ones, there are things about network economics, the death spiral of the grid. Some very interesting ideas about lawsuits. Once you start suing directors of companies for not managing the risk of climate change, or managers of investment portfolios, the concept of reasonable behavior could shift. If the concept of reasonable behavior shifts and rises, reasonable risk management, then other directors have to behave in a similar way, and before you know it, nobody wants a portfolio filled with carbon. So lots of these dynamics that we are exploring, and I'd love at the end of this to say, you forgot this other dynamic, and we're taking notes, and we'll have a think about them. And then, of course, we're trying to translate these into the sorts of intervention points. So what kind of policies might trigger or accelerate some of these self-reinforcing dynamics? And just to pick up on one of them, one of these sensitive intervention points might be the relatively trivial amounts of money, 15 billion, being increased on the R&D budget in clean energy. Now, we can have a debate about whether that's likely to be useful, but thus far, small amounts of money, 15 billion is a very, very small amount of money. And I think most of the large oil companies probably spend alone, each of them, over 30-odd billion on looking for additional oil and gas every year. So, and we spend in total several hundred billion on the fossil economy every year. So these are not large numbers, but we might find leveraged effects because some of that money ends up with Henry Snaith's lab, who's been supported by the Oxford Mountain School, among other supporters, developing much, much lower cost solar cells, etc. So, it's clear that technology, as Doyne's explained, is one of these points of leverage, but there are going to be social points of leverage and political points of leverage too. Right, so suppose we succeed. Well, where does that take us? In a sense, you want the problems of success, but unless you're willing to confront the problems of success, you might not get the success. Yeah. So, here's Didcot Power Station. Bye-bye. I'm running over time, but that says it all. How do investors in assets consider their risk? Well, they have only to read the Oxford Mountain School Working Principles for Investment in Fossil Fuels. And if you're about to ask me a question about Oxford's investment strategy, I'm going to refer you to this. But you want to understand the science of net zero, have a strategy for your business getting to net zero, and make sure you're measuring your way there. What about countries? Well, we want to be prepared for what is a completely different industrial ecosystem in the economic world. The Saudis are getting prepared, believe it or not. The UAE is getting prepared. And Penny and Alex and some of the team here has been doing work on green complexity, trying to work out which countries are best prepared for a clean economy and away from the fossil economy. And you can actually start to do some really quite interesting work here. So here's Germany, South Korea. I'm not going to labor this given time, Saudi Arabia and Uganda. In terms of their areas of expertise, once you look at the structure of their exports in green sectors. And because of path dependency, some countries are going to find this a whole lot easier to manage than others. And the core point for me is that you don't say, well, bye-bye Iran. We've got to help those countries find a pathway to having some prosperous existence in a clean economy. Otherwise, they are the people who are going to most strongly resist the transition. So it's about identifying these challenges and solving them ahead of time. Similarly, there'll be a lot of jobs lost in the fossil sector. It looks like there are going to be even more jobs gained and created in the green sector because the job per kilowatt in the clean economy looks like it's a bit higher. Now, a macroeconomist will say, well, this is irrelevant, whatever. It's a washout. These are tiny numbers compared to the economy as a whole. But politically, this is not irrelevant. When you've got concentrated job losses in particular states of the US or particular regions of the UK or anywhere else, this becomes a political issue. So it may not be a macroeconomic issue, but it's a political issue, and it's worthwhile understanding, being able to identify in advance where these jobs are going to go, and then finding ways, it's possibly difficult, but ways of transitioning those communities to doing other things that are profitable and productive in a post-carbon world. Right, so with that, we are almost done, and we're over time. So I'm going to ask Doyne do you want to come and join me, perhaps, and we can answer questions jointly that way. But our plans are headed to do 4 broad things. Firstly, make sure that we've got a qualitative understanding of all of these different system dynamics. So that's, in a sense, part of what today is. We're going to crowdsource some more system dynamics, and if you don't get to say your idea, send us an email. we're going to be developing a suite of quantitative models, little models initially, to try and understand the scale, the pace of these different dynamics across tech progress, across heterogeneity, inequality, demographic work, and looking at the impact on labor, assets, and nations. And then possibly, if time allows, if more funding emerges, integrate these models into a really substantial integrated assessment model of the kind that gives us numbers like 5% loss of consumption by 2100, and we'll see what that number would be if you're able to model the dynamics properly.
Yeah. We should emphasize on that one that this is not on our set of deliverables, but we want it to be on our deliverables. So we're looking for ways to do that, because we're a lot of the other activities are enablers of doing that.
And the last thing is that we've got the interdisciplinary team here. We are Oxford, which means we do have some intellectual capability, but it's not all in this place. We've got a network of other academics from around the world. Believe it or not, a professor from Cambridge is coming over in a week, but it goes beyond the UK too. And there's a lot of intelligence across business and government that we need to pull in here. So this is not simply an Oxford project. It needs to be effectively a global project if it's to work. So I think with that, we're going to go to some questions and say thank you very much.
Sure, you can run it. Yeah. Questions?
Let's start at the back.
Let's start at the back, right?
Thanks. I just wanted to ask, really, are you really so sure that the factors that are missing out of the integrated assessment models that might make costs cheaper are more important than the ones that might make it more expensive? And you highlighted several drawbacks to do with rationality, to do with perfect policy implementations, and actually some of the trajectories, as you showed when you had the two curves that had a big reduction in the emissions per GDP, still didn't get you anywhere near the amount of reductions that were required in these models to actually reach these very ambitious goals. And particularly if we try to do that in the context of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, which the countries have committed to. And maybe while there's synergies between those in the near term, there are potentially very big conflicts, potentially, to get to net zero. And are we really sure that those factors are actually not more important and actually might make it much more expensive than the cheapening factors that you talked about?
That's a great question. I know you're going to want to answer that. So do I. But let's take three before we do.
I hate that.
Oh, well, sorry. So we want any up the back first, and especially some women too. No women up the back. There's women up the front. So up the front now.
Gentleman with glasses, and then this lady here.
Thank you for the lecture. The point 4 on your penultimate slide, you're talking to government and business leaders. Look what happened a year ago when the electorate rejected what they perceive as being talked down to by the elite. Right at the beginning of your lecture, you had a 2-dimensional matrix, but you left out the 3rd dimension of how you're going to promulgate the message to the world. So could you comment on that, please?
Yep. Okay. And
Hello, Sue Roberts from South Oxfordshire Sustainability. David Attenborough, when asked about what he thought about the progress of solar and green energy, said that he was not interested in having even more energy with which we could continue to wreck the world. And when you talk about the 5% reduction in consumption, according to the IPCC, is that necessarily such a bad thing? Should we not be looking for prosperity without growth?
all right. Why don't you take Richard's, and
Okay.
I'll take the second. Well,
Okay,
you can
sounds
split
good.
up how you like.
So Richard made a good point. Of course, if we have more assumptions of rationality and optimality, that ought to be better and helps us towards getting to the goals. But, I guess a couple of things. It's balancing that against a lot of other assumptions that I think are highly unrealistic, in particular about technological change. So, and let me say one other thing. In that scenario, we only went to 50%, right? if we go to 100%, it would have looked silly because it would have gone to 0, right? So partly what that's showing you is that it's key, of course, to get to 50% renewables as fast as possible. But if we actually get to 100%, then greenhouse gas emissions go close to 0. And
There's nothing silly about that, by the way.
What?
There's nothing silly about greenhouse gases going to 0.
There's nothing silly about that. That's what we have to do.
Yeah.
But I think your point is well taken, that rationality is a good thing in that regard.
Can I just add to something? I think there's often an implicit status quo bias, not in a behavioral sense, but just in the current, where we are is optimal. If we assume that, then any deviation has to be costly. So we're deviating to a clean world, therefore it's costly. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's part of the logic of it. Let me pick up the other two. So, yeah, I mean, you can't get change through political elites alone, if at all. And so part of shifting this world needs to be a shift in the narrative. But the narratives that get promulgated also do come from these models. I mean, as nuts as that may sound. Separately, well, not entirely separately to this project, I have a friend and I'm an investor in a company that does mass movements. And we have other relationships with civil society groups who can pick up on some of these themes and take them out there. But and we're here talking to you before we're talking to the Secretary of State about this project. So I think your point's well taken. It's very important to be engaging broadly. It's also important to be engaging with the narrative constructors, effectively, both the IPCC and the politicians who are effectively selling us these narratives that we then swallow.
Let me just make one other comment on that. I mean, I think you can kind of separate the problem into first understanding what we should do, and then figuring out how to actually make that happen. And it, of course, helps if we actually really understand what we should do so that we can put forth some predictions with confidence of the cause-effect type. If we take this course of action, this is where we will end up. The more we can reduce that uncertainty, the better our forecast and more believable and reliable our forecast can be, the easier the other part becomes.
So on the prosperity without growth point, I mean, for those of you who don't know, this is a kind of an old discussion, and at least old for me. I think what most of us want is prosperity. And so the with or without growth point is an addendum to the prosperity bit. For what it's worth, my view is that we're going to want more energy, need more energy, and a lot of the people on the planet have a right to a lot more energy. So the challenge isn't to, cut back on global energy use. It's to deliver clean energy use. Now, it's undeniably true that you're going to have some interesting consequences of a lot of very cheap, clean energy. We may be seeing challenges to groundwater because solar pumps are so cheap and so effective that people can access water that they couldn't access before. But the flip side is they're not dying of thirst anymore. So, ultimately, this isn't a kind of inevitable problem. It's a problem that can be overcome because by harnessing the energy that's coming into the earth, if you're being a physicist for a second, a lot of what prosperity is about is reordering things, reducing their entropy. And if you're to do that, happily we're in an open system with a flux of energy coming into us, and we can use that energy to create more prosperity.
Yeah, succinctly, it's not energy that causes the problems. The problems are pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, environmental degradation due to those things. So I think it's important to focus on the things we don't like rather than the sort of thing that has been the intermediate vector in the fossil fuel age.
Great. So should we do...
David has a comment that
okay.
I know
you know what
he
his
can do a better
is.
job of responding to Richard than I can,
okay.
So I want to hear what he has to say.
All right.
Thanks, David Hendry. I think this concept of rationality is grossly oversold in these models. You think of the mess, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which are wholly based in so-called rational arguments, have made in totally misunderstanding the financial crisis, austerity, and its consequences. Rationality becomes a very difficult thing to define in a world of change. And you show us change is happening at a tremendous rate in fossil fuels. So I do think that removing rationality in the sense of, oh, today is going to be like tomorrow from these models would be a very good step.
Thank you, David.
We have a question right up the back, and then those two, and Kingsmill, if we have time, we'll get you in.
Thanks. I have a question about electrical power, because you have many industrial processes that consume a lot of energy very fast. And you cannot provide that with solar cells. You probably need batteries. And as far as I know, I think there are very few batteries that can give you that sort of power. And they are very expensive. So my question is, have you got any data about the technological progress of battery technology? And if so, is it similar to the one in solar cells?
Yep. Okay. Good question. There's one exactly.
You talked about stranded labour and transitioning over into new industries, and presumably that would require new skill sets, in fact, radically new skill sets for those transitioning. Is that within the scope of your research to look at both what that requires and how to do that? And if not, who should be looking at that?
Yep, great. Short answer is yes, it is. And then up the front is Kingsmill and the lady behind. And then we are going to have very quick answers.
So the first question is, you have these models which seek to predict the future, but actually I think that's somewhat jejune, because as your models indeed and the diagram shows, once you get over the tipping point, you start racing down the hill, you've no idea what's going to happen. So surely, therefore, you should be focusing considerably more on what happens to get to this point of marginal change, which may be actually be extremely quick. And then secondly, if I may very quickly, the market actually may be in a position to solve some of the problems better than you imagine. So, for example, at the end of the 1890s, the world was concerned that London would be 9 foot deep in horse manure by 1930, and lo and behold, within 10 years, Ford to solve the problem. So perhaps actually we're much closer to a solution than you might imagine, provided the governments don't mess it up.
Okay, great. And there's a question behind, which is very indulgent of me, given that it's 2 minutes to 6.
Given the success of social media in getting Trump elected, wouldn't it be worth investing in social media and propaganda so that we can change people's minds?
Right, so
I'll take the battery question
go on,
first.
Yeah.
So batteries, yes. Storage, energy storage more broadly is what you should be concerned about, because batteries aren't the only way to store energy. And we're collecting lots of data on that, and we've got to solve energy storage. That's, I think, the hardest problem to get all the way to a complete renewables society. Now, batteries are an interesting case because they seem to be breaking their historical trend. Batteries improved at about 1% per year over the 20th century. But there was not the push to improve them that there has been in the last 15 years. So batteries actually are now improving faster than they were before, as far as we can tell. And I want to emphasize, batteries are not the only way to go. I mean, in fact, for power, if you're Sweden, you can store energy by just, pumping water uphill into a reservoir somewhere. And down the line, a lot of people think nanocapacitors may ultimately give us very efficient, mass-producible ways of storing power. So there are lots of things out there, but you're quite right to finger that as the main problem that really needs to be solved, and that's very much a part of our thinking.
If I just may quickly add, your point about being able to deliver the amount of heat at the rate required through the electricity system is a fair one, and chemical, whether using power to gas, power to hydrogen, another key variable might be the cost of electrolyzers falling, which they are quite fast. On occupations, It's a great question. I think sitting 2 rows behind you is the woman who's going to answer it for us. So you can talk to each other. That's a way I can save some time. Up the front, questions were, are we underestimating it all? I hope so. And should we be focusing on getting us to those critical points? Absolutely, that's what we're trying to do. And that's the focus, finding these sensitive intervention points. And then the last question, Trump got elected on social media, therefore should we do propaganda? I'm not sure about propaganda, but I certainly want the narratives to be in line with the facts, let me put it that way. And if that requires all sorts of megaphones, Twitter and otherwise, then I think we should be using them.
Yeah, maybe, part of it is reframing the intellectual debate. There's a fascinating book, The Road to Mount Peleron, I think it's called, which is about basically how Milton Friedman and Hayek and others very intentionally said we need to create a new economics and we need to create the political structures to enable that, and that led to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Now, not that we want to replicate Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but it is an illustration of the power of ideas, and that is in having the proper intellectual underpinning really made a big change in the world. That intellectual underpinning, in my opinion, was wrong, but it was persuasive. And so we do need to find a way to, first of all, understand what the right framework is, what are the right set of ideas, and make them persuasive so that we can change the political dialogue.
Thank you very much.